Well, welcome. We're taking you away from US programming to bring you this CNBC moderated WEF panel on the global economic outlook. By the way, Karen, nice to see you.
Yes,
it's the first time I've actually properly seen you here in Davos. And what a different Davos it is in many ways.
I mean, but that's a good point. What a different Davos it is. Last time we were here, we were talking about very different economic conditions, weren't we? The fact that we had ultra-low interest rates for as far as the eye could see, pandemic that not everybody could really clock what it was going to mean for the world economy. But now we're talking about inflation. Yeah. We're talking about rising interest rates.
Yeah, and I think the war in Ukraine, of course, has put a lot of CEOs, a lot of policymakers, a lot of NGOs, and I know you were just speaking to one of the biggest NGOs, Oxfam, recently as well. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of people are now stunningly concerned about this confluence of events. We've heard it, of course, from Kristalina Georgieva, who is on Geoff's panel as well, which is coming up in a few moments' time, about this confluence of events. I would argue that some of these events were inevitable, and from when I say argue, you know full well about me arguing, because you and I have done most of our healthy debates over the last 10 years or so. But I think a lot of the events that are happening now are compounded by problems that have been sitting in the background for a long time. Huge amount of sovereign debt out there, the huge valuations on a lot of asset classes which have come off as well. So I think there are things that will eventually one had to see changes to, which are added to these extra factors that are going on at the moment.
Ultra easy policy. I don't think everybody's been on the same page that the economy warranted this amount of stimulus from a fiscal side, from a monetary position. And we've heard from the ECB in a blog post from Christine Lagarde, very, very clear that there is now a pathway to higher rates. We're looking at a July timeframe and then follow-ups at subsequent meetings and then into next year. And I think the world, particularly Europe, is on notice that the conditions are changing here too. But what's unusual, I think, is that the lack of clarity about down the line. I mean, we keep hearing this phrase about front-loading monetary policy, and that's from the Fed in particular, that they think conditions might change at some point. Yeah. And it does beg the question whether the ECB might be too late to bank some ammunition, whether they've let inflation...
I noticed your language about higher rates rather than high rates, because I'm a great believer that we have negative rates which are close to the historic levels of the last 50 years. I know in the mid-70s we had some rates which were double-digit negative, but still we're knocking on the door of 7-8% in some jurisdictions. Geoff will be introducing his panel in a few moments' time, but I'm just going to tell you that on that panel as well is François Villeroy de Galhau, the Governor of the Bank of France, Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citi, Kristalina Georgieva, who we mentioned there, the MD of the IMF, and David Rubenstein, who is the co-founder and co-chair over at Carlyle. So you've got business, you've got investment, you've got the huge multinational or multilateral organisation, the IMF, and of course the central banks in the form of the Bank of France.
I just talk about France because I was in Paris for the recent election, and of course the economy is front and centre. There's a cost of living crisis playing out in many economies across Europe, some worse than others. France itself has intervened on energy prices to put a cap, trying to take pressure off consumers. But I think beyond France and beyond Europe, there is pressure around this inflation story.
Which I think is incredibly debatable whether there should be any form of energy caps. We've got a lot of energy-based guests tomorrow. I've already spoken a lot to people, including the Finance Minister of Malaysia, about these energy caps. Should they be there? Should the money from these higher energy prices be putting onto caps across the board rather than specific caps, or actually no caps at all, and going towards the renewable economy, towards the energy transition, towards digitisation, to all the original plans that were supposed to be part of the COVID recovery plan as well.
I was just talking to Oxfam about that too. They believe that some of the windfall profits should be distributed in the form of tax and then to the poorest in society. So they are completely disagreeing with that picture about investing in the future and the transition. They think the money needs to go now to those that are most hit by this crisis. So very different views, right? I think I agree with you that there is a transition taking place, and unless we tackle the big challenge of climate change down the track, then we've got bigger issues as well. So, you know, there's, I think, a very mixed view as how to tackle some of these issues right now.
The climate crisis isn't going away. The problem is for those advocating strong action on that, strong action on desertification, on climate change, on renewables, on getting to net zero, is that another crisis keeps coming along. Of course, between COP21 and COP26, both of which I attended, we had one of the biggest pandemics we've seen for the last 100 years or so. Now we have a war which is threatening, according to many, including the IMF, to actually be one of the most difficult events since the Second World War as well. So there keeps coming clear and present dangers, which is putting the medium to longer term dangers perhaps a little bit on the shelf in some people's minds.
I don't know how much you've heard about debt forgiveness, but that is something that's clearly cropped up, whether parts of the world need to have debt forgiveness. And of course, we spoke about it during the Eurozone crisis before.
Well, look, Geoff is discussing these risks of the global growth with a panel of top public and corporate business leaders. Let's listen in.
Very warm welcome, everybody, to this World Economic Forum panel on the global outlook. My name is Geoff Cutmore. I work for CNBC, and you'll catch me Monday to Friday for 3 hours in the morning doing the Squawk Box program. So hopefully after this panel is finished, if you haven't already found me or CNBC, you will reach out and do so. Good. So what I want to do here is start off this panel by engaging you, our audience, before I start to ask questions of our panelists. And I want you to help me direct questions at our panel. And the question I have for you is, are we heading into recession or not? And what I'd like from you, and let me just tell you, the room is quite dark, so most of our panelists won't be able to identify you if you do put your hand up. So be reassured and be confident that you won't necessarily be seen voting. But what I'd like to do is just, with a show of hands, ask the room, the brains trust here at the World Economic Forum, the people in the audience who are concerned or believe that we are heading into a recession, could you please put your hand up? Okay, just very roughly, that feels like around half of the room to me. Nodding heads, about half the room. Right, okay. Let me ask you a different question. Who believes that the global economy will have a soft landing and that ultimately policymakers in our central banks and in our governments and heads of business will help the global economy achieve a soft landing? Who thinks that that is the most likely outcome? Please raise your hands. Okay, well, this is not scientific in any sense of the word, but on a simple count of hands in the room, I would say that around half of you feel that a recession is very likely, and a small number of you are confident that a soft landing can be achieved. So I think that gives us a very good sense of the mood in the room, and that, of course, helps me shape my questions to our panel. And let me introduce our panel, because I've made them sit here and not say anything for a few moments, and I think it's important that we bring them in because they are all very important people with very interesting connections to the global economy. So let me start with Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF. Good to have you with us, of course. You appear to have set the tone, almost, of this meeting by talking about the confluence of calamities that are facing the global economy right now. So hopefully we will address some of those potential calamities, and we will address how policymakers can best negotiate them. François Villeroy de Galhau, the Governor of the Bank of France, a very warm welcome. You're also on the ECB Council, of course. You said on Friday that our short-term priority is fighting and mastering inflation. Events have overtaken us in a sense that Christine Lagarde today has made it very clear that the ECB is now embarking on a rate hiking cycle this year, and we may even see 50 basis points at a single meeting. We will see. I love the Gallic shrug so early on in the panel. Jane Fraser is the CEO of Citi, who forecast a brutal winter for markets, not at the beginning of the year, not a month ago, back in October of 2021. So your crystal ball was working very well, I have to say. You also expressed caution about the Chinese economy coming off the boil. So that, again, was another very prescient call, and I'm now thinking about relocating my pension fund, given that she seems to be so accurate on what is likely to unfold in markets. And David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-chair of Carlyle Group. Great to have you on the panel. You told CNBC back on the 5th of May, inflation has been a problem, but it should not cause a recession. And I think we can update that view because you were on CNBC earlier today, and I think you reiterated pretty much the same point, that you feel we can escape recession, as did President Biden when he was asked the same question. So you're in a esteemed company in Tokyo within the last 24 hours or so. So let me get on to some questions. The OECD has just trimmed first quarter GDP quarter on quarter to zero or negative for most of the G7 economies. So given the mood in the room here, Managing Director, are we actually already in a recession in some G7 economies? And how concerned should we be about that?
You scared the audience effectively, but I can tell you, you have not scared your panel. So my answer is going to be no, not at this point. It doesn't mean it is out of question. We have downgraded our projections for growth for this year in April for 143 countries. This is 86% of global GDP. And since then, in a short period of time, a little bit like the weather here in Davos, the horizon has darkened. Why has it darkened? Well, when we did our projections, the war was already ongoing. Now we see the consequences going far and fast. In addition to that, tightening of financial conditions, dollar appreciation, and China slowing down. James' prediction, unfortunately, has materialized. So we are looking down this 2022. It is going to be a tough year. We have commodity price shock in many countries, and the particular shock I want to bring your attention to is food price shock. Over the last week, because of that sense that maybe the economy is getting into tougher waters, oil price went down. But food price continues to go up, 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 up. Why? We can shrink the use of petrol when growth slows down, but we have to eat every day. And the anxiety around access to food at a reasonable price globally is hitting the roof. And I don't want to be too negative at the start, but the climate crisis has gone nowhere. The digital money has hit a little rough spot. We expected that, and it happened. Nonetheless, think of numbers. 3.6 is our prediction. There is a long way from 3.6 to global recession. What we may see is recession in some countries that are weak to begin with. They haven't recovered from the COVID-induced crisis. They are highly dependent on imports from Russia of energy or imports of food, and they have somewhat weaker environment already. But we have not seen that yet.
So you've laid out, I think, very clearly for us some of the ongoing challenges. David, why do you feel more confident that recession can be escaped, and is that only for the United States?
Well, when I worked in the White House under President Carter, the inflation advisor, Fred Kahn, said that he thought we were heading into a recession right before the 1980 presidential election. And President Carter called him into the Oval Office and said, look, I'm running for re-election. Don't use the R word. It scares people. So Fred Kahn said, what am I supposed to do? I'm an honest man. So he said, just don't use the R word. Subsequently, Fred Kahn said he thought we were heading into a banana. And he used the word banana because he realized reporters wouldn't put a headline that said, Fred Kahn thinks we're heading into a banana. So I'm very reluctant to use the word recession. But let me just say that we're not in a banana yet, but I think the signs are not as favorable as I would like, only because the war in Russia and Ukraine is not likely to end soon. If the war ended tomorrow, I think the economy would bounce back. But since it's not likely to end tomorrow, I suspect that will be the precipitating factor, given all the food chain and energy problems that come about because of it. So I think I don't want to say we're in a banana, but I would say a banana may not be that far away from where we are today, unless the war ends very quickly.
It's such an important question. I think we should let every panelist have a go at this. Jane, how do you feel about the outlook from here?
Yeah, I think, David, to your point about the R word, there are 3 R words right now. It's Russia, it's recession, and it's rates. And it depends where in the world which one is more prevalent. So in the States, it's much more about rates because there's more resiliency in the economy, in the labor market, in the consumer. The consumer is sitting there on $3.4 trillion of deposits. Coming into COVID, they were sitting on $1 trillion. So there's some buffer there. To be seen if it's used wisely or not, the jury will be out on that. I think much more concerning for Europe, that is right in the middle of the storms from supply chains, from energy crisis, and obviously just the proximity to some of the atrocities that are occurring in Ukraine. When you go elsewhere in the world, I'm just back from being in Asia and in the Middle East, and it was wonderful to see those countries again in person. They're different than they were coming out of going into COVID. When they come out of COVID, they are stronger. They're coming out of the lockdowns. There's some more sense of optimism there, and I think even China is seeing this as an event that's occurring rather than a long-term trend. They'll no doubt have some packages that they'll come to stimulate the economy. Food, to the managing director's point, is, I think, the big worry here, because that could be the wild card. When people are hungry around the world, and there's going to be 1.5 billion hungry people without necessarily either the means nor the access to food, particularly in Africa, but not only, that is a problem.
We'll come back to the policy response and how we can address that, because clearly there is going to be a difference in how people experience a dramatic economic slowdown. I just wanted to be very clear, though, because you mentioned Europe in your answer. Are you pretty much convinced, then, that Europe will experience a recession?
Yes.
Let's take this to the Bank of France governor.
And I hope I'm wrong.
Can I bring this to you, Governor, because, and let me, if you don't mind, put another little spin on this. Is the EU ultimately going to drive Europe into recession by insisting that it abandons Russian oil and gas at this stage, or is there an alternative?
So to take the European view, first we all knew from day one that this war was bad economic news, less growth and more inflation. And this is the price we accepted together to pay to protect our values, to be at the side of Ukraine and democracy. It was worth probably paying this price. We now know a bit more about the effects in Europe. About activity, and this is why I would disagree with Jane, at least so far. Activity is obviously less buoyant than at the end of last year. We had a growth in the euro area of more than 5%, 7% in France, so it was really record high. But it's resilient. If you look at German IFO this morning or at Banque de France monthly surveys, and the IMF forecast for the euro area this year was 2.7%. We'll see where we are, but it's still significantly positive. By the way, services are in better shape than industry, so it's an opposite image if you compare to COVID. So the main problem, at least in the short run, is inflation, without any doubt. And inflation in the euro area is not only higher, even is slightly less high than in the US, but 7.4%, but it's also broader, and this is probably the main issue. Core inflation is 3.4%. And this is why we have to normalize monetary policy. Without any doubt, it's what President Christine Lagarde said very clearly this morning. There is an increasing consensus in our governing council about the start of the journey. Let me say one word about our aim at the end of the journey, at least in 2 years, 24. We will bring inflation back towards 2%. And this is not only in all our forecasts. Look at all forecasts, including from the IMF. But it's our commitment. And we will do it through normalization of monetary policy and not tightening. I will perhaps elaborate on that. It's a normalization. the question of growth will come back. But I would play down the idea of a short-term trade-off between inflation and growth. In the short run, our priority is clearly, as you reminded, fighting inflation, and we will do it.
So, Governor, very clear answer. Can you be equally clear with this answer? Are rate hikes in July and August now a done deal?
In August, we have no meeting, Geoff.
September? Well, you can have an emergency meeting at any point.
Side. But do you want me to elaborate? No.
July and September.
Perhaps a general consideration. Attention is focusing very much on the short term. When will we precisely end net asset purchases? When will we have the first rate hike? All of this is important, but frankly, if you look at President Lagarde's statement this morning, the deal is probably done because there is a growing consensus. I think that the next steps of the journey are now more important. I made a speech 2 weeks ago about a possible roadmap going towards neutral rate and, yes, achieving 2% in 24. I wouldn't over-focus on what will precisely happen in July, September, etc. But we have a roadmap.
So I think central banks used to not tell people what they were going to do, and they didn't talk about it after they did it. You had to figure it out by figuring out what was going on in the market. Now, since Ben Bernanke in the United States and then Janet Yellen and Jay Powell, the Fed chairs have said it's better to tell people what we're going to do and explain what we did. And there's a plus to that. But the downside is once you say what you're going to do, if you don't do it, you've got bigger problems. So having said we're going to have 2 consecutive 50 basis point increases in the next FOMC meetings, if we don't do that, people are going to think that, A, we have no concern about inflation any longer, and that's probably not realistic, or if they give a bigger increase than the 50 basis points, people are going to say, oh, it's a bigger problem than they thought before. So either way, it's a difficult thing to do anything other than what you said. And so I think what the Fed chairman said, it's 50 basis points the next 2 meetings. I think it'd be unlikely he would change that position.
2021, we were told that this was transitory inflation. 2022, the beginning of, we were told this is transitory inflation. Effectively, the causes of that inflation were misdiagnosed, and now we're told that the right medicine is to dramatically hike interest rates to choke off demand. We were told this is a supply-side problem. How do we know that the right medicine is actually to give the European economy 2 interest rate hikes so far, July and September, and perhaps the 2 that we're talking about in the United States?
Well,
may I?
Go ahead.
Sorry, 2 quick reactions. First, you speak, Geoff, of dramatic rate hikes, etc. This is not the kind of words which are in Christine Lagarde's statement or in my expressions. I use the word normalization for a very simple reason. We are still releasing the accelerator. We had exceptionally accommodative monetary policy with asset purchases, negative interest rates, even in our cases. And as far as we are not at neutral rate, it remains accommodative. So we are releasing the accelerator. We will see if later, after the neutral rate, we have to press the brake. And second, you are again with this idea there 50 basis points hike, etc. Frankly, we are not there. What is important is to see this journey, and it's not a dramatic change in the language. It's a change in the situation. There was a supply side shock last year, you are right. But it's why I mentioned that core inflation is increasing. And if you allow me a technical remark, in our forward guidance in the ECB, we have an important condition on underlying inflation, the third one. I think it's more and more important because if it is about core inflation, then monetary policy is relevant again.
With global debt higher than it was in 2008, inevitably markets are going to take this kind of messaging badly. David?
On inflation, I just wanted to add, it's probably a mistake for all of us to comment on these things and think about these things, to have thought that you could stimulate the U.S. economy as much as we did because of COVID, and stimulate the European economy as much as they did because of COVID, and to think that there wouldn't be inflation coming about as a result. Plus, the very loose policies the Federal Reserve and other European central banks had in terms of buying securities and so forth. So that was probably oversight to think that that wasn't going to produce inflation. And then when the war came in Ukraine, that compounded the whole thing. What we've learned before is that when inflation gets into the system, it takes a while to get in, but it takes a lot longer to get it out. And that's what Paul Volcker always used to say. It takes a lot longer to get inflation out of the system than get into the system. It's taken a couple years to get it in. It's going to take a while to get it out.
Jane.
I think the reality is that when you're asking any of us what's the rest of the year going to be like, we don't know. There's uncertainties, I think, that will get clearer around supply chains. So if all goes well, we're starting to see the supply of commodities beginning to outstrip demand because, to the managing director's point, you have an ability to reduce down demand somewhat on the commodity front, excluding food. So I think we're getting quite optimistic that there is a path forward from the chaos we've been seeing, that the supply and demand imbalances on commodities will ease up. That will help. But on all of the geopolitical and the other fronts, we just don't know. And so what we're asking of our central bankers is a very difficult thing, which is to take actions now without quite knowing where they'll overshoot or undershoot. And I think we've got to have some patience here and really have our eyes open and understanding what happens to consumer behavior, what happens to confidence, what happens in the corporate sector, and take this step by step.
Well, Kristalina, I mean, Managing Director, one of the problems with this story is that we know that, in part, the supply chain challenges have now become incredibly politicized. You know, the focus very much for companies all around the world is looking at the manufacturing hub of China and China's response to COVID. And we've talked a lot about that, you and I, in recent months, and you've given very frank views about how you think that living alongside COVID has to be the right response. But here today, we now have President Biden ratcheting up the tension again with China over the issue of Taiwan. This will only increasingly politicize the supply chain story and encourage disinvestment of Chinese businesses in America and American businesses from China. How does this help with inflation?
Let's go back. In 2021, we were all overly optimistic that having vaccines is going to eliminate lockdowns. And at that point, we didn't think that supply chain interruptions are going to play a major role. Now we know better. Supply chain interruptions because of COVID today are a major factor for the Chinese economy, for the Asian economies, for the world. The second thing we learned with the war is that there could be unthinkable shock that adds fuel to the inflation. And that is a broader lesson. We do live in a more shock-prone world. What is the conclusion if you are a business person? Forget about politicizing, not politicizing. You would say, I have to change my view of economic efficiency to include supply chain predictability. Security of supplies clearly cannot anymore be left on the theme of least cost solution. And therefore, we all have to think of the years to come, whether this change in our concept of economic efficiency that includes supply security may be a more permanent factor pushing prices up. And if it is, then, since you say I'm very frank, I will be very frank, then we all have to think collectively whether we can afford the luxury of fragmenting our economies even further. What is going on in this more shock-prone world should press us to seek ways in which we work more together. But we draw a lesson, and I'm sure Jane would know this lesson from experience, that if we want our people to support us working together, we have to be less obsessed with globalizing profit and more with localizing benefits for communities and countries. So, to put a positive note here, we did get a tax deal, 137 countries agreeing that there has to be a fair distribution of profits of global companies, some for the country they are generated, some for the countries they come from. And there should be a minimal tax that everybody subscribes to. In other words, more fairness in the way we split benefits. And then think of how, as a world, we ought to be striving for our children, for our grandchildren, to enjoy benefits of higher standard of living. If we fragment the world, we are all going to be poorer. And one point I was raising my hand. Jane talked about the fact that different countries are in very different places. And that makes me go back to recession. Today, there are two countries in deep recession. Ukraine, at least 35, maybe 40% contraction. And Russia, vis-à-vis our October projection, 11.5% contraction. And there are countries that are so severely hit by spillover of events like Sri Lanka or Lebanon or Egypt, where the pain is felt. They are in a more difficult place. But you go to the United States, in the United States, no bananas.
Well, David, you want to pick up?
Well, 2 points I'd like to add. One, all recessions are not equal. The definition of a recession varies, and some people would say it's just 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. If you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, it can be a mild recession. And recessions aren't the end of the earth. They typically happen every 7 years or so. So it shouldn't be a great cause for alarm if it's a mild recession. Second point is that why, when all the stimulus was going into the economy, did people not worry about inflation? To some extent, the central bank's mission has changed. When the central banks were set up, their main mission was stable currency, little inflation. In recent years, decades, the mission has been changed a bit. It's worry about unemployment. And the concern about unemployment has gone to make central banks more worried about things like rising interest rates, because that will produce higher unemployment. And that's a bigger concern. That was not a concern 30 or 40 years ago, when they were really only worried about currency and currency stability. So that's a big factor. So when interest rates started, when we had the COVID problem, we could have increased interest rates and increased unemployment, but the Federal Reserve recognized that its mission was to kind of keep unemployment low, too.
Well, let me come back at you then. What do you make of the capital market reaction that we've had to the actions that the central bank has taken so far? It seems to me that there is, as we near this correction territory for the S&P, there is an argument here that the markets have overreacted. But what's your impression?
Remember when Ben Bernanke once said, maybe at some point we'll slow down quantitative easing, there was a so-called taper tantrum. And all of a sudden the market acted like they can't believe he was saying that. This time, the Federal Reserve has been saying very carefully, here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you in advance, no surprises, no tantrums, please. And the markets overreacted. Why? Because markets are nervous and markets like to overreact. It's like the markets have overreacted to what the Fed is doing. And I can't control the markets, but I think they have overreacted a bit.
Well, they have also been complacent.
Hang on a second. I'll bring you in just a second. I know everybody wants to get in on this. But David, let me just press you for a moment, because markets have overreacted, and we think about the markets as the S&P and the Dow. If you look at the technology stocks, some of them are down over 70, 80%. It looks like 2000s tech crash all over again for some companies in that space.
Well, it's not really that.
Is this not 2.0.
In the crash that occurred in 1999, 2000, 2001, you had internet companies with no revenues, obviously no earnings. They had nothing but a business plan in some cases, and those companies shouldn't have gone public, let alone maybe been getting any capital. Now you've got a company like Netflix, which has 250 million subscribers. It may not have been worth what it was worth in the market a few months ago, but it's certainly worth probably more, in my view, than it's currently traded for. Markets overreact, and when they overreact, that's a chance for good investors to go in and say there's an overreaction and buy at the bottom.
Well, there's for every Netflix, there's a Peloton or another business. I mean, I'll push it back at you, because there are a lot of people who look at the way that Wall Street has behaved over recent years, the whole SPAC phenomena, the way that the private equity community have thrown money at moonshot ideas. Has this been an irresponsible phase, and is this part of the reason why we're now going to have to take our pain?
Well, I'm not defending Wall Street and everything that was done in the SPAC market and all the valuations put on all the companies, but some of the companies that were highly valued and people made fun of for a while, like Amazon. Take Amazon. People made fun of it in 1999 and 2000, said it really shouldn't exist, and obviously turned out to be a great company. A lot of these companies whose values have gone down recently are still great companies, and maybe the value is overreacted by the market. I think there's some great buys there. I don't think it's all of a case where 1999 and 2000. Now, SPACs is a different situation. That may be a phenomenon that may not come back again.
Anyway, sitting on a bank that sees a lot of these flows and activity globally, I think one of our observations in the US is it's actually been remarkably orderly amongst the investors. They have not sprinted to the door the way they have it with the world financial crisis when that crash happened, and where we were in 2020. We have seen a fairly systematic takedown and change in asset allocation. The fixed income markets, when we look at issuance, have been incredibly constructive. We haven't seen problems of companies or governments, indeed, being able to access the markets. And debt issuance has been identical to 2019 as it has been this year. So I think it's important not to confuse order and orderly shifts to the changes that David's talking about with some necessary corrections that occur. And from our perspective, frankly, what Chairman Powell is wanting to have happen, which is an adjustment in the behavior, and in the States, it's not only that the inflation, but it's adjustment in risk assets. We're seeing that occurring in the equity market, the credit market. There isn't so much strain yet. We've seen some in commodities. We've seen a bit in high yield, but this hasn't been the catastrophe it could have been.
Governor.
First, I want to reassure David about central bank's mission. In our case, ECB, at least, it remains very simple. We have a single primary mandate, price stability, full stop. So our
in the United States, it's changed.
I said it at least from the ECB standpoint. But can I come back to what Kristalina said about the supply side? Because I think it's extremely important. To put it in a nutshell, there are two significant changes this year. First, inflation is back, and this is why we will normalize monetary policy and we will deliver. And second, we are not allowed to forget about growth, but the policies are not the same. If you look at the last 10 years, it was mainly on the demand side, especially during COVID, thanks to accommodative monetary policy, and yes, fiscal policy. These two support policies will have less space for obvious reasons. And now, growth is linked with supply-side policies, be it trade, and yes, rules, and avoid fragmentation is possible, education, investment, climate change, etc. And we shouldn't forget this part of the agenda. Inflation is priority number one short-term. Supply side is a priority for the middle term. Can I introduce a last reflection on that, Geoff? Growth remains a positive word, probably for most of us in this audience. But if we look to our fellow citizens, unfortunately, it's not the case. If I would oversimplify, for our older fellow citizens, growth is over, and for our younger citizens, growth is dangerous, because it's a threat to climate, etc. So we must win this battle and show, and this was our discussion in the G7 last week with Kristalina and others, we must show that growth is still possible thanks to modern supply-side policies, and that it is a condition to have fairness and climate transition.
Wow.
But this is a battle which is absolutely key.
We haven't mentioned globalization, and globalization has been a deflationary situation. It really helped keep inflation down. Now, because people are challenging globalization and because supply chains are being brought back into various countries, it's probably inflationary, and that's one of the reasons we have more inflation now, because people are worried about globalization for other strategic reasons.
Yeah, we'll come back to this globalization story, because I've got another angle around the financial aspect to this. But, Governor, I just wanted to come back to you because I have a quote. You responded to a view expressed, I think, about the way that COVID money was handed out and the approach that President Macron's government took. Many people see debt as limitless and cost-free. You said such a seductive double illusion is our greatest danger today. And yet we hear governments now talking about a fiscal response to the unequal pain that is being felt by inflation. We've just had overnight from the States, I think, a $40 billion spending plan put forward. The Commission is now talking about suspending the fiscal rules until 2023. The Commission is talking about raising money in the debt markets for the green transition, the energy transition. Who knows where that money is going to end up? They raised money in the debt markets to address some of the pandemic impact. It seems to me that no one is listening to your words here, that governments feel that they can continue to spend and raise money in the debt markets even as interest rates are rising. Something's going to break, isn't it?
To put it in a nutshell, because it was a long and sophisticated question. But these were exceptional circumstances, COVID, which required exceptional answers. So I supported in France and in all our countries, Kristalina, the so-called whatever it takes. But the illusion that it will last forever is very dangerous. Yeah. 2 years ago, the debt had almost no cost because we had zero or even negative interest rates, and no limits because everybody was borrowing. But now that has a cost everywhere, in the US, in Europe, it has a positive cost. If you look at the 10-year US, it's 3%. If you look at France, it's 1.6%. So it's a dramatic change. And second, it has limits because it cannot be exceptional circumstances forever. This is why we should care about sustainability. And I believe that we can find other ways to finance these supply changes Kristalina mentioned, associating also private resourcing and funding. In our case in Europe, it's the so-called capital markets union. So not everybody should rely on fiscal policy.
Yep. I mean, unfortunately, it always seems to be an exceptional circumstance, doesn't it, when governments raise money to address problems in the economy. David, very quickly, and I want to bring the managing director in because she's waited a long time to respond.
You raised a very good point on debt, which we hadn't talked about. The United States has now $31 trillion of debt, 31 trillion, about 129% of GDP. The only Western European country with higher GDP ratio is Italy. So we have a very high debt ratio, and the truth is we've been paying this debt for a long time with very low interest. As interest rates rise, it's going to eat up more and more of the budget. Right now we're spending 7 to 10% of our budget in the federal government on interest. It's going to rise to the teens and higher than that, and so that's a big problem, which I think is a bigger economic problem in the future than almost anything we've talked about.
Managing Director, let me come to you because I want to ask a slightly different question, but it does relate to everything we've talked about. The World Economic Forum's own economist survey threw up an incredible statistic. I think of the 50 economists that they had in this survey, 90% of those economists expect average real wages to fall across low-income economies. Now, back to this question of the appropriate policy response. How do you protect those people without worsening inflation, but guaranteeing they have access to food, to the security they need to live a good life?
From the very beginning of the pandemic, we have been ringing the alarm bell that there is a dangerous divergence in economic fortunes between advanced economies, middle-income countries, low-income countries. Remember the statistics. Advanced economies port 28% equivalent of GDP in support for their households and their businesses. Middle-income countries, 6%. Low-income countries, 2% of a tiny GDP. This is first time in the last decades when poor countries, rather than catching up with those better off, are falling further behind. Why should we all in this room worry about it? Because it breeds instability in these countries. What can be done? You're asking the right question, Geoff. What can be done is, first, for richer countries to stick to their pledges to support low-income countries. Two, for institutions like mine to, in relative terms, step up support for those who most need it. Last year, we did $650 billion new allocation of special drawing rights. This year, we are doing, for the first time, a massive transfer of special drawing rights from countries like France, that gets it, but has a great central bank and a policy, very, very sound policy. They don't need this so much. So France committed 20%, other countries followed. We are now moving this money to be able to support exactly what you're flagging, the tragedy of poor countries, often not by fault of their own, but by exogenous shocks, the COVID and now the war, to be able to sustain these shocks and secure, the livelihoods, the lives of their people. I would add a third point that is so critical for our conversation. We must improve the way we cooperate, but not throw the baby with the bathwater. Globalization has served the world well, except that we made a big error to pretend that it has worked equally well for everybody everywhere. It did not. So concentrate on fixing what needs fixing so these countries can have a chance to be part of global value chains, to offer their people better opportunities. And this is why we are here in Davos, to do exactly that.
Jane,
Yes.
you're welcome to applaud. Please do. Please do. Jane, I just wanted to come back because, what David, in a way, implies with this hike in interest rates is there's going to be an even more intense competition for global capital. But I think we're now beginning to see the start of real deglobalization of the financial economy, because the sanctions against Russia have just told anybody that has dollar reserves they can be seized at any time, and your access to the SWIFT system for payment settlement can be closed off at any time. We've had a salutary lesson on how easy it is to cancel countries in monetary terms. Now, I don't want to pick on you, but I know that since you've been at Citi, you've now talked about exiting 13 markets. That's the kind of message that's the kind of act that sends a message that increasingly you don't see a value in being in some of these international markets as we see this deglobalization of the financial economy. So one, the competition for capital is going to increase, which is going to encourage countries to put up interest rates that can't afford them. And two, companies like yours that are relocating out of those economies are taking your business away from them.
So we're not exiting 13 countries.
So I read it wrong in the reports?
We open our bank stores in 97 countries every day. We operate 160, and we intend to stay that way.
So you are not selling the retail operations in Mexico, in China, in Russia, in Brazil?
I'm exiting a consumer business line to focus on the institutional clients that we serve in those countries, precisely because we see such growth in globalization. Our bank moves $4 trillion of volume a day in foreign exchange, cash management and trade. That number is going to be 10 trillion before we know it. It requires significant investment. So I think, like many industries and many different companies around the world, we all have to invest in digitization, in scaling up, in being able to operate with the scale and speed of a digital world. To bring that back to globalization, what are the threats and what are the opportunities, therefore, from what we're seeing? Clearly, there are threats of fragmentation, splintering. There's been some weaponization of not just financial services through sanctions, but trade flows and other pieces. So it's changing the nature of globalization. I think one of the critical pieces is what do we need to solve to tackle exactly what we're all talking about here? And it picks up a bit of what David said. It's the technological advances that will enable us to move supply chain resilience. It takes someone 5 to 10 years to move supply chains dominated by China to other parts of the world and build this out. These are problems that are going to take long. It's a Herculean task to get the global economy to greenify. I mean, it's a complete overhaul of the global economy that's required. These are big challenges. They're sources of important resilience for globalization going on. And we're all going to have to be institutions with a brain and institutions with a soul, and operating both of those together to solve these problems. It can be done, but we've got to work on this on long-term problem solving, and it's exactly what David said.
Your question pointed out a very good point. There are 3 financial consequences, leaving aside inflation, to what's happened in Russia. One is the banking system. It's clear you can shut people out of the banking system. People hadn't realized you could do that so easily. Second is the confiscation, you could argue, or freezing of somebody's assets. Nobody had ever thought you could take the dollars in somebody's foreign reserve account and freeze them. And that's a big issue that the Chinese are obviously going to have to think about, because they have $3.2 trillion in foreign reserves, and they're probably wondering, could this happen to us? And the third issue is the centrality of the dollar. The dollar is still almighty dollar. While people say it's another reserve currency might come along, it's going to be a long time before there's another reserve currency. But people are worried that the dollar is now so powerful and so important that other countries are going to say, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
Well, Governor, the intriguing question really that I don't suppose you'll answer, but I will ask you, because you have talked about the value of the euro, is did the euro just get too weak to the dollar? And that's why the ECB is responding, because the euro is now at 2017 levels against the greenback, and that is importing inflation into the eurozone. Are you responding to the euro?
I will try to answer your question. No, Geoff, we have no exchange rate target, obviously. We have an inflation target, but exchange rate matters. And I repeat it here, because imported inflation can put us away from our target. But our monetary policy is not targeted for exchange rate purposes. Can I add one thing on globalization? Because there is a risk of deglobalization or fragmentation. We should be careful about that. I agree with Kristalina. Obviously, there should be common rules, common values, but can I plead that at least in payments, we shouldn't have a fragmented world? Because if it's a fourth financial consequence you didn't quote, it would be a catastrophe, including for diversification of flows as the one you mentioned. We could have geopolitical fragmentation in payments. We could have also private fragmentation. By the way, this could be one of the very few good news of the last weeks or months, that we said clearly in the G7 that we appealed for a quick, global, strong regulation of crypto assets worldwide. If we can take this opportunity, we will protect investors and we will preserve the world from an unnecessary fragmentation.
Christine Lagarde said they're worth nothing. Why are we regulating an asset class that has no value?
Because there are several investors around the world, including many young people, who have lost much in recent months. And the illusion, and frankly it was an illusion, that you can have an investment with a high reward and low risk, it should be regulated, explained. There are also anti-money laundering issues. There are some countries like China which intend to prohibit crypto assets. I think it's more innovative and more innovation-friendly to say we regulate them, but it's an emergency question now. And again, we said it last week in the G7. I strongly hope we will have this regulation in Europe this year. We can have it in the US and elsewhere. We will have done our job.
Managing Director, I want to come to you on this, but David, very quickly,
on crypto,
19,000 cryptocurrencies. Are any of them worth anything?
Well, crypto, the younger generation says the older generation has devalued the dollar or the value of the currency, so maybe something else isn't so bad. Secondly, if they put a smaller percentage of their net worth in, it's not likely to bankrupt them. But the most important thing that's coming out of this, I think, is this. Whether crypto is worth X or Y or Z, to a lot of people it doesn't make a difference. The government can't get it and figure out what you have. So a lot of wealthy people who want to hide their assets after the Russian situation will say, all right, I'll put 5% or 10% in some basket of cryptocurrencies. The government won't know what I have. They can't get it, and I can always get access to it. So I think people are not going to be dismissing these cryptocurrencies because it can be hidden from the government, and that's what people want to do in some cases.
Since you brought that up, and the Managing Director mentioned the agreement on a global tax deal, if the Republicans win in the midterms, is that tax deal dead?
Well, whether they win or they don't, I think the tax deal isn't going to happen. Global tax deals always sound great, but getting them implemented is very, very difficult because somebody always kind of breaks the system. So I'm not sure, even if the Democrats were to win the House, all of a sudden the global tax system that we've talked about will come into being. I think it has some good sense, but getting a global tax system is one of the hardest things to do in the world. And getting all these countries to agree on a certain minimum rate, I think it's going to be very difficult to do.
Managing Director, you can come in on any of these topics.
Yeah. On this one, of course, it is very difficult. This is why for a whole decade we would be in meetings, François and me, and there would be discussion about a tax deal, and I frankly would switch off because I know nothing is going to come out of it. But now there is a renewed sense that there has to be more fairness and that taxation matters. And if we are not able to fix it, then we would be all poorer because we would be more fragmented. And that gives a bit of a chance for a tax deal. Maybe it would be somewhat modified. Maybe you're right, David, and nothing is going to happen. But in my lifetime, this is the best moment we have had. And it is on the basis of wanting to have a world economy that works better for majority of countries and people, not just for the few.
I agree with look, it's a good thing. I applaud people that worked on it, but my experience is that what motivates humans and all beings, species, is one, staying alive, eating, shelter, reproduction, and tax avoidance. And tax avoidance is one of the great motivators of human life, and I just worry that it won't be able to be implemented so well.
Look, we can talk about that all night long because we have 3 minutes. Adam Smith, going back to the father of the market economy, what did he say? What do we need for a country from a mess to turn into a prosperous country? We need peace, low taxes, and rule of law. So I'm all for low taxes, but I'm against income from poor countries being sucked into rich countries, leaving the problem you asked me about unaddressed. And can I say something about digital?
We can go a little bit longer, I'm told.
Okay. one big responsibility for all of us is to actually explain to people what is what. What is central bank digital currency? What is stable coin? What is the differentiation between real stable coins and non-stable stable coins? And what is crypto? We haven't done our job. When we look at stable coins, this is the area where the big mess happened. If a stable coin is backed with assets one-to-one, it is stable. When it is not backed with assets, but it is promised to deliver 20% return, it's a pyramid. What happens to pyramids? Eventually, they fall to pieces. And that is where regulation, Christine is talking about this segment, but regulating the stable coins, ensuring interoperability of CBDCs, and recognizing that Bitcoin may be called coin, but it's not money. All of this we need to work on.
Governor, very quickly, see if I can get along the line very quickly.
No, very briefly on that. First, I agree 150% with Kristalina. By the way, you have an excellent panel at 6 on CBDC, so don't miss it. And no, I only wanted to bring good news, hopefully, on this tax agreement. We could have good news on the European side, and believe me, having unanimity of EU 27 is not that obvious. We could have good news till June, and then the good news might cross the Atlantic. And I think there is a sense of common responsibility. What is at stake with this crypto regulation, with taxation? It's not bureaucracy, it's not red tape. It's giving our fellow citizens the feeling that globalization can be fair. And if we miss these two opportunities, there are examples, but very good example. If we miss these two opportunities, we will have missed something much more dramatic. Because here in Davos, or in this room, we are in favor of globalization, but we must show that it can be fair, green, and bring more social justice. So let us take the opportunity. It's a burning political question.
Jane, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, so if you look at what's happening in the world, we're unbundling from what was the old institutions of the world financial order, and we're now rebundling around new digital architectures that are largely born digital. So there's a disconnect between the two. And I think to the point we're talking on crypto, or we're talking on all the different dimensions in the world, the imperative is that we bring with that the safeguards, the independence of institutions, and some of the software to make sure that that new system around these digital architectures does fulfill the promise and the opportunity they can afford for inclusion, for tackling the countries that are having challenges here. But it's going to require a lot of brain power and thought rather than just economic opportunism to make sure they work. So we love the technology, not sure about some of the crypto products as an example.
It says time out on the board, but I'm going to grab a couple of minutes just to wrap up, because it's always better to finish these panels on a generally positive note, I find, and we've talked about a lot of the challenges here and that confluence of potential calamities that we could be facing. So maybe if I could just leave each of you with the opportunity to say in a few moments, what is the most positive thing that policymakers could do to make sure we have an easier ride going forward than perhaps some of the messages from the audience have suggested we will have?
I would say over the last 25 years, we've had at least 3 crises that are worse than this. The bubble burst of the early part of this century, the COVID problem, and the Great Recession. They were all far worse than where we're faced right now. And I think the people responsible for the government and the economies recognize the challenge we have. People are on top of it. And I don't think it's going to be the crisis that we've experienced in the last 25 years in any of those 3 instances. It'll be a mild banana if there's a banana.
Jane.
Build long-term resilience, and thinking in the longer term, let's get the government policies for climate change and the framework we need in place for the longer term, the same for healthcare for the next pandemic, and the same for the economic resilience that we need and the social resilience. We need some more long-term policies, long-term planning here.
Governor.
My positive message would be that democracies are not that bad. And we had we had an impressive proof. We reacted together, stronger, quicker, and more united than expected to the war. And look at what happened to two non-democracies. They didn't. We have painful debates, divisions, but they didn't avoid very heavy mistakes. Probably China for its COVID strategy and Russia for its Ukraine invasion. It's a good lesson.
Managing Director.
The overlaying crisis upon a crisis, they have taught us a very important lesson. Think of the unthinkable. Pandemic, stopping the economy, unthinkable. War in Europe, until it happened, unthinkable. How many more unthinkables are going to come? And the positive is that now that we know that this concept of resilience, resilient people, educated, healthy, with social protection under their feet, resilient planet, one that we care about to pass to the next generation in good shape, and resilient economy that is more than just the banking sector, labor conditions, how we work, all this matters. And I honestly think very positively about us becoming more mature and therefore more able to deal. Only one problem for me, David, I would never think of banana the same way as I did before.
Oh, okay. Well, on that very positive note, let me wrap up the panel. Our panelists have been terrific. You as an audience have been terrific. Please thank them for their contributions here. And thank you, everybody that's watching at home or in your office. I hope you've enjoyed this event from the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Thank you, Geoff.
Right, so that was Geoff with his panel there. An excellent panel, actually laced with humour as well, I thought, actually. I think they all seemed like they were enjoying themselves as well.
Geoff enjoyed it, didn't he? He was very much enjoying the questions.
Yeah, there's some good lines in there as well. I mean, look, we'll just go through this a bit slowly for the next couple of minutes. We are hoping to get Geoff back on set to see what he thought of it as well. But it all started off with Kristalina Georgieva saying, actually, Geoff, you've scared the audience, but you have not scared the panel regarding the prospects of a recession going forward. And David Rubenstein then went on just addressing that point that Kristalina Georgieva was saying about bananas, because in the Carter administration you couldn't say the word banana, couldn't say the word recession, so you called it banana. Now, of course, Rubenstein towards the end of that panel saying, actually, I think there will be a banana, but it won't be a severe one.
Well, lots of fruit references, right? But if we talk about the recession, I think it was very interesting to hear Kristalina Georgieva push back about that. That's been such a big fear about whether we're already seeing elements of pain across the economy because of interest rates, and we talk about the ECB, what's been flagged up today, but also with the cost of living crisis, the inflation that we're witnessing. But she pushed back about whether parts of the G7 are already in recession. I think that was welcome to hear.
Yet, Jane Fraser of Citi very categorically went through the regions where she had been travelling most recently, the Middle East and Asia, and noted the resilience and, in many cases, a post-COVID growth recovery, but said she felt that there were a couple of big problems. One, that Europe will experience a recession, which of course was disputed by one or two on the panel. And also, she said the wild card here, and it's something actually I'm talking about on a panel in the next 24 hours, is food. And the crisis which is coming now to large parts of the world. We know that food prices have gone through the roof. We know that there is an export blockade of a lot of Ukrainian wheat to the world from the Russian blockade in the Black Sea. So the question there is 1.5 billion people being hungry. What could that possibly do as a wild card to upset the world economy?
Well, no one wants to say the R word these days, but she mentioned three: Russia, recession, rates. And effectively, as you say, she pointed out different parts of the world. And after the retail numbers we had recently from the United States, particularly Target, which was one that roiled the market, that it's seeing inflation, can't pass this on to customers, doesn't think it's the right thing to do. She was saying about the amount under deposit still for a lot of the Americans that built up savings, 3.4 trillion deposits versus $1 trillion coming into
money
COVID.
being used on US credit cards at the moment. It's gone through the roof. That wasn't mentioned.
And of course, you know, more higher mortgage costs now now at this point, but Europe in the middle of the storm. And I think we feel that, and we hear it from a lot of policymakers, although it was interesting to hear the Bank of France push back, and don't forget through the lens of France, that is an economy that has been more resilient in Europe, in contrast almost to Germany, for instance, which has been the powerhouse for many years. The services side has held up in France, and the economy broadly has been decent.
It's an Elysee Palace that has failed ignominiously, and you know this better than I do, in its targets to reduce the public sector. So whilst I take your point about French resilience, it has been based on a way higher public spending, a way higher public debt than was promised by the Macron administration.
This was thanks to COVID, right? They were tackling it initially, then it went right back up again with pandemic stimulus. I think the hope now is...
Words, there's always exceptional circumstances for one of the panellists. Other nations, and I was just talking to the Swedish finance minister, actually have managed to keep their debt to GDP low. I do want to move on to the interest rate scenario. I thought that was a fascinating debate there. And David Rubenstein pointing out the importance of roadmaps being kept to. And, of course, Villeroy de Galhau was pointing out that Madame Lagarde's most recent comments earlier this morning were saying, look, the July rise is baked in, and it would be a great surprise if there wasn't that. And David was clearly pointing out that the 250 basis point rises that are baked in from the Federal Reserve, they must be kept to. And if you don't do them, then what's the problem? And if you do them, is the problem greater than you thought? So very important, once you have a roadmap, to stick to the roadmap.
His interpretation was, for me, that he thinks there's too much scripting by central bankers these days, that there used to be a level of uncertainty, and that gave the central bankers wriggle room. But now this fixed pathway that they're having to spell out to the markets in terms of forward guidance keeps them, unfortunately, less dynamic. I think that was a concern, that you start to question, well, if we're not going to get another 50 basis points back to back, is there something wrong with the economy? Is there something wrong with debt levels?
Absolutely.
You start questioning and jumping at shadows effectively. But that's the same with the ECB. I liked how Geoff subtly tried to draw the Bank of France governor in on whether there could be an out-of-cycle meeting, whether August could just get slotted in and move to try and catch up. But it didn't sound like that at this stage. That's July and
in the
September.
Mediterranean at that moment in time. But I thought there was a great reference to the markets as well, and it was actually a nice interchange between... Well, funny enough, you and I were disputing who it was between, actually, but I thought... We know for a fact it was David Rubenstein, though, who was saying he did not believe the markets should have overreacted the way they have done, because, of course, there was a roadmap laid out by... the Federal Reserve, and the markets haven't taken it very well indeed. They've taken it very badly as well. And he said the markets overreacted, to which one of the panellists, and we won't say who, because to be honest, I thought it was Georgieva, you thought it was Jane Fraser. And we were actually chatting at the time, not looking at the screen. So the point was, the commentator said, I think the markets have been complacent. I thought that was very interesting. Maybe Geoff will clarify when he comes on set.
Picking up a last bit of sun that's just disappeared now, which is a little about the economy, isn't it? It does change. But just on that point, too, around what David was saying, I mean, I just actually bumped into one of the bosses over at the NASDAQ, the vice chairman of the NASDAQ, as we talk about technology. And there is a concern that we have seen such an extreme rout in technology names and what that effectively means for valuations, for funding in the sector. And it was interesting. And I think a lot of investors who like tech stocks still will be quite relieved to hear that he thinks that some of the reaction has been too much, that 50, 70 or more is too much in these companies that do have a growth model versus the dot-com boom and bust, where there is a company that no revenue, no profit, no business model, that he was saying that's different this time round. And, you know, if you look at the valuations, maybe they've corrected too far, given what these companies do.
Yeah, again, debatable. The man himself just walked in, so we'll come to him in a few moments' time. But David Rubenstein adding that it is not 1999, 2000 redux for all of those reasons you just meant. David Rubenstein also making some very good points about deglobalization, about how globalization for decades, for a very long period, especially, of course, with the growth of China and Asia, has been a force for deflation. And now, of course, because of security fears and all kinds of other concerns, we're seeing shortening supply chains, we're seeing localization, we're seeing jobs and supply chains brought back home as well, and that is adding to global inflation.
Yeah, it's a real pushback, isn't it? And for many years, even with that pause around COVID, we've been talking about deglobalization, economic nationalism, self-interest. I had a terrific conversation with someone the other day, talking about the problem with these isolationist policies and food security, potentially even for the UK when it comes to supply chains. I mean, the food comes in through Europe, doesn't it? And when we talk about Brexit.
It does, but a lot of LNG comes in through the UK too. We're the second largest LNG port. So look, you look like you've run up the stairs. So we have something we need to ask you, first of all. We love the panel. We love the banana references. We love the interchange as well. I thought it was Georgieva. Karen thought it was Jane Fraser, who said the markets have been complacent, in answer to David Rubenstein, who said the markets had overreacted. Do you remember that little bit?
It was a long panel. It was well over an hour.
Sorry, but we were not paying attention to the screen. We heard the comment, markets being complacent, but on the back of what David said, and you said to that panelist, I'll come back to you in a few moments' time.
Yes.
No, okay, don't worry. I can never remember my panels.
No, I have a feeling that it was Jane, but I wouldn't want to swear to that at this point because
I'm not going to have to play back the whole thing to find out. No, you know how competitive Karen and I.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing from the head of news, actually. Yeah. It was definitely Georgieva.
Oh, okay.
So I would take.
Was I even there? Was I even in that panel?
No, but do you know what it's like? I mean, we can let viewers know something. When you're doing a panel, you're constantly managing so many things, including people in your ear as well. And you don't always follow every iota because you're waiting to say, oh, that's a good answer, but I need to work on my next bit. I need to work out who I'm going to take it to. So panels are very complicated things when you're doing them. But anyway, it was brilliant.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It's like juggling plates, going downhill on a skateboard with blindfolds on, sometimes.
I'm looking forward to my two panels tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Can we start at the top of the hill and talk about recession? Because that was where you started the conversation. Are we going that way in terms of the economy?
Naughty man scaring the audience.
Right.
You got a slap on the wrist from that from Mrs. Georgieva.
Yes, I did. But it was what I thought was really interesting is just how open and frank, actually, a number of the panelists were being. I mean, the fact that Jane spoke quite clearly about the possibility of recession in Europe.
Boom. We just said that.
And a decent track record, given you just fleshed out that she called that there would be tough times for stocks.
Called the difficult markets, called the prospect of a slowdown in China, really on the money on that story. And she's not long been at Citi, but very quickly she has taken some very big decisions about what Citi is going to look like as a bank going forward. And we did have a bit of to and fro when it came to the consumer retail banking segments that they are actually moving out of in many markets. And maybe there are Citi-specific reasons for the fact that they're doing that, but it did play to the broader conversation about, are we actually seeing capital being sucked out of some economies at the moment because either they're not being seen as attractive growth opportunities or they don't have attractive yields because the interest rates are relatively low compared to the dollar. So, I still think there's something there, and we continue to focus on that. And the other thing that really I was very surprised by is that the Bank of France governor said it's a done deal.
Yes.
It's a done deal.
But that was
rate hikes in July and September.
So I was just going to come to you because long before you joined us, but I mean, God, you've been with us over a decade as well. There was a CEO who got trapped by his own predictions about CAGR, annualized growth rates, basically, and he got himself in a really big mess about it to Geoff and I. And when we came back to him, he's like, oh, and I think that the central bankers are getting themselves tied into their roadmap because David Rubenstein came back and said, well, if you don't go by your roadmap or you don't do those rate hikes you've said you can do, or you do them higher than you said you can do, then people are going to worry about what's going on as well. So they're tying themselves into these roadmaps, aren't they?
They haven't even moved, though, don't forget. So I think the messaging around the timing that July years ago now is very similar to the United States about signalling the lift-off point. I liked your question about trying to extract out whether there could be some sort of extraordinary decision trying to catch up with an August meeting.
Yeah, well, that's always possible. I mean, it's somewhat disingenuous to say, no, we don't have a meeting then.
Here and here.
But actually, we know that central banks can be very reactive when they feel they need to move more aggressively. So in between scheduled exceptional meetings do take place. It's something that does happen. But you remember that phrase that we used to hear all the time from the European Central Bank, we do not pre-commit. We do not pre-commit. And that's back to the point that David Rubenstein was making, that actually now central banks have to be very clear. There has to be a lot of clarity about the messaging, and they are suddenly on a railroad. And if they come off that railroad, the markets don't like it.
Do you think that the Bank of France governor is too optimistic? I mean, looking at the French economy, they're saying it's been more resilient than what you've had across the board, even compared to Germany these days. I mean, versus Italy, that's saddled with debt, more exposed to rising interest rates. Do you think they're too optimistic there, and perhaps that they're going to change their tune? A little bit like what we were seeing, where the discussion around inflation is now it's not transitory. We've moved, and in fact, we need to catch up a little bit on interest rates. We've got to move to 50 basis points. Do you think we could see him change his tune in coming months?
I think it's, look, I mean, the problem is that if you're a member of the ECB Governing Council, then you are collectively committed to the decisions that are made in the European Central Bank. And we know that ever since its inception, we know that that's been the problem, because different economies in Europe have operated at different speeds, and what's been good for the Italians or the Spanish and maybe the French has not been great for the Germans or the Austrians or some of of the other Northern European countries who've pushed back. And I think, you know, the OECD put out those updated forecasts today, and effectively they said a lot of the G7 countries actually didn't have growth quarter on quarter, and France was somewhere in the middle of the pack. I think it was a 0 for France, whilst they said it was a negative for the USA and a negative for Italy, and there were a few other economies that were mentioned. So I think it is going to be challenging. I mean, at least the one thing you could argue is that President Macron has a mandate now and has some years to maybe bring in the structural reforms that have been so long promised for France to make its economy more agile.
About the public sector cuts?
Well, I was saying that did go down initially before the pandemic, then went right back up again, no doubt, saddled by pandemic debts. But the bid now is trying to pull it back lower. But, of course, that requires deep cuts across the board. And we know that's very challenging when you've got inflation playing out, cost of living crisis.
Basically, jobs galore and people being paid vast amounts of money. It's a great time to cut the public sector because the private sector apparently can pick up the slack.
Right, but if you think about the challenge now, we've moved from one crisis to the next. I mean, no country's immune from this inflation problem. And it's energy on one side, it is food security, food inflation on the other. And you think about France, a very wide population again, where you have a fairly large disparity. So it is hard to make these hard reforms again, which tackle the very people that you try to help.
Yeah, no, I agree. But what's worse than no growth? High inflation and no growth. And I guess that's where maybe you give the balance of doubt to the central bankers and you say, look, inflation, once it escapes the box, is very hard to get back in the box, and it's devastating for families and communities, particularly with very low growth. And whilst if in the short term the central bankers can address the inflationary pressure and we end up with something that looks like a short and shallow recession, well, as David Rubenstein was pointing out, in the old days we used to have those recessions all the time, and they cleansed the system to a degree, and it didn't mean that thousands of people were thrown out of work. It just meant that maybe 1 or 2 years went by where they didn't see a great deal of salary increase.
The whole point that we were told about the negative interest rates and the asset purchase program and the quantitative easing was that actually we were terrified as a global economy of deflation. But if we ever got inflation back because of all these factors being put in, and this was in the early days, and we had these debates on set with just about everyone and with the policymakers and some of Geoff's big interviews as well, we were told that's okay. When inflation comes, we really know how to do it. But disinflation or deflation, that's where we got our worry. That's why we're taking this extraordinary historic action. Now we've got this burst of inflation, and I'm still of the camp that there is a high degree of impotence going on because they can't afford to raise rates to anywhere near the real rate of money, to positive rates of money. We're nowhere near those kind of levels.
Well, it actually just went up, didn't it? I did like your comments too around China and the COVID situation. And that was really interesting to hear that, well, potentially we could just get more stimulus on the back of it. The Asian economies will just stimulate again. And we do get the sense that we are going through this inflation problem. Central banks may overreact and we could be in a recession. And where does the help come from this time round? Economies they can't stimulate.
Just becoming quicker and quicker towards what we have here in the West.
No, I mean, look, there probably are some countries that have a little bit of headroom, but they're also terrified about inflation, I guess, and also that competition for capital shouldn't be ignored. I mean, we look at the way that the dollar index has moved recently, and that's telling you a lot of things about people losing faith in other currencies and maybe other economies. And when that begins to happen and you need to service dollar-denominated debt, you actually need some of that money to come back. And how do you attract it? You offer a yield over and above what you see in the United States. And that's going to be a problem because you're killing your own domestic economy to service your dollar-denominated debt.
The final question was fascinating. And it was actually rather positive for us because we're all quite cynical in many ways. But I liked it. What was the most positive thing you could say? I thought some of the answers were extraordinary. Not going to be a bad banana, i.e. recession in Carter administration terms as well. Lessons of think the unthinkable from Kristalina Georgieva as well. I think James Fraser, more positive. Sorry, you have a sub-comment check.
What we normally do.
But I've got something to say about this, by the way, in a second. But the Villeroy de Galhau, democracies aren't that bad, are they, after all? And I thought that was amazing because, we haven't got a Russian delegation here at WEF. I haven't seen a vast amount of Chinese officials here so far. I'm yet to be shown that as well. So I think actually it's saying, hey, authoritarian regimes have made some horrendous mistakes over COVID, have made dire global effects on the world economy and the world because of the war in Europe as well. Actually, us liberal democracies, there was a bit of a rallying cry once again for the liberal democracies.
That we reacted together comments, that we were stronger. You look at what we've done in Europe.
Who would have thought it? I wouldn't have thought it. And I'm a fan of Western liberal democracy. I didn't think they could act like this. Did you?
Well, the problem we've still got is that maybe the world can come together on a single issue when a state like Russia invades its near neighbour, and we can have a unified response. But we were talking about the global tax deal. That looked like we got a unified response. But I don't think there's anybody that will take your money today on a bet that it's going to get done before the end of this year, particularly with the midterms coming up and some concern as to whether actually the Republicans end up with Congress, whether it was sunk. And even David Rubenstein was saying, look, even if it's the Democrats, I don't believe it's going to get done because there are too many vested interests working against it.
At a time when you're looking at transatlantic unison for once as well, that could actually really straight away increase those divides that we've seen for most of the last, dare I say it, Trump administration and perhaps a large amount of this administration.
When you say timing, my mind just went to 2023. Most commentators are saying that is the year when it gets challenging. We might be okay for 2022, but by next year, that's when the economy gets dicey. So targeting corporations, they're going to have to try and support the economy, support workers, and not drive up unemployment with much higher tax. That is going to be very tricky to enact.
I've got something to say. And I don't know if you two have realised it. And in fact, put us all in vision again, if you would, because this is important. This is the first time we've had the three of us on set together since before COVID. Did you know that? Did either of you two realise that?
Oh my goodness, no, I hadn't realised that.
This is the first
and on location.
In 2.5 years that I've been like that. I can touch Karen. HR watching. That Geoff's over there. But we have not been like this. And it's been absolutely lovely.
So 5 days when the three of us are no longer on air, you know what happened to us.
No. Let's not talk
Anyway,
about that.
you've got to...
Let's focus, accentuate the positives, diminish the negatives. That's what I was trying to do on my panel towards the end of the panel, because, boy, there's a whole lot of speed bumps we've got to negotiate before we get to the end of this year.
Yeah. Karen, I think that's your read.
I think we're going to wrap it up here. So join us again tomorrow for much more from Davos. Highlights include the Publicis Group Chairman Maurice Levy, Standard Chartered Group Chairman Jose Vinales, the Nokia CEO Pekka Lundmark, and Volkswagen CEO Herbert Diess. We're also going to hear from the CEOs of ABN AMRO, AXA and Solvay, plus the global chairman of PwC, Bob Moritz. That is all for today, and Geoff, well done again on the panel.
It's not it for today? Actually, I can't say, because in case it's a pre-record, I'll exclusive interview later on.
We have a very big interview with the head of state, so we will bring you those developments as they come.
Maybe tomorrow, though. We don't know what the bosses have decided.
Exactly. We're going to hand it back to our colleague stateside.
Last week's low. Back in a moment.